In the early years of the 13th century, the balance of power across Asia began to collapse with astonishing speed. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries disappeared within a generation. Trade cities that once controlled the movement of silk, horses, gold, and grain suddenly found themselves exposed to forces they did not fully understand. Entire armies vanished into the dust of the steppe. And behind much of that transformation stood a man who had once been an outcast among the nomadic tribes of Mongolia. By 1218, the name of Genghis Khan had already spread far beyond the grasslands where his empire was born. To settle civilizations, he appeared less like a conqueror and more like a natural disaster moving westward. Reports arrived from caravans, refugees, and terrified governors describing cavalry forces that crossed impossible distances, armies that never seemed exhausted, commanders who adapted faster than their enemies could react. But even then, few rulers truly understood what the Mongols had become. Many still imagined them as another confederation of steppe raiders, dangerous in open country, but incapable of dismantling large states. That assumption would prove catastrophic. In Central Asia, one of the most unstable regions of the era was the territory controlled by the Qara Khitai Khanate, a fractured empire created decades earlier by Khitan elites fleeing northern China after the collapse of the Liao dynasty. The Khitans had carried Chinese administrative traditions westward into the Islamic world, ruling over a vast and diverse population that included Turkic tribes, Persian merchants, oasis cities, and nomadic clans spread across modern-day Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and western China. For years, the Qara Khitai state survived by balancing these competing groups while controlling major trade arteries along the Silk Road. But by the second decade of the 13th century, its authority had weakened dangerously. The empire was increasingly divided by internal distrust, shifting tribal loyalties, and regional governors who cared more about survival than obedience. Into this instability stepped a man named Kuchlug. Kuchlug was not originally Khitan. He was a Naiman prince, part of a powerful confederation defeated by Genghis Khan during the Mongol unification wars. After losing his homeland, Kuchlug fled westward into Qara Khitai territory seeking refuge. At first, he arrived as a displaced noble dependent on the mercy of another ruler. But exile often produces dangerous men. Over time, Kuchlug maneuvered himself into power through marriage alliances, political manipulation, and military opportunism. Eventually, he seized effective control of the Qara Khitai Khanate itself, reducing its legitimate rulers into symbolic figures while consolidating authority around his own followers. His rise fundamentally changed the political climate of Central Asia. Unlike the earlier Khitan rulers, who had generally tolerated the religious and ethnic diversity of the region, Kuchlug ruled with increasing suspicion and brutality. Muslim communities, particularly in oasis cities, faced mounting pressure. Local elites grew resentful. Tribal loyalties became unstable. Governors questioned whether the state could survive at all. At the same time, far to the east, the Mongol Empire continued expanding. Genghis Khan was not simply conquering territory. He was building a system designed around mobility, discipline, intelligence gathering, and relentless operational flexibility. His commanders learned to think in terms of campaigns rather than individual battles. Communication networks stretched across enormous distances. Scouts mapped terrain months before armies arrived. Defeated enemies were sometimes absorbed into Mongol service, providing specialized knowledge and additional manpower. Every campaign became preparation for the next. The Mongols also understood something many settled empires did not. Fear could function as a weapon long before combat began. Rumors spread ahead of their armies with almost strategic precision. Tales of massacres, impossible marches, and total annihilation weakened resistance before the first arrow was fired. Some cities surrendered immediately. Others hesitated too long and disappeared entirely. But Central Asia presented a different kind of challenge. The region was vast, fragmented, and politically unstable. Supply lines could break easily. Local alliances shifted rapidly. Mountain passes narrowed movement. Desert crossings punished logistical mistakes with lethal efficiency. Any invading army risked isolation. Yet these same conditions favored the Mongols more than most civilizations realized. The Mongol military system had evolved within harsh environments where survival depended on movement, coordination, and endurance. Their cavalry traveled with multiple horses per rider, allowing extraordinary operational speed. Their commanders rarely relied on rigid formations. Instead, They adapted constantly to terrain and enemy behavior. Against slow centralized armies, they appeared almost impossible to pin down. By 1218, Genghis Khan had begun looking west not merely for expansion, but for security. Kuchulug represented more than an enemy ruler. He represented unfinished business. The Naimans had once resisted Mongol domination fiercely. As long as Kuchulug remained in power, he offered a rallying point for anti-Mongol resistance across Central Asia. He also threatened trade routes critical to the growing Mongol Empire. And perhaps most importantly, Kuchulug had developed a reputation for instability that alienated many of his own subjects. To Genghis Khan, this created opportunity. The Mongols often preferred exploiting political fractures instead of relying solely on brute force. If local populations hated their rulers enough, conquest became easier, cheaper, and faster. So Genghis Khan selected one of his most trusted generals for the campaign westward. Jebi. Among Mongol commanders, Jebi occupied a unique position. According to Mongol tradition, he had once been an enemy archer who wounded Genghis Khan's horse during battle. Rather than executing him after capture, Genghis recognized his skill and loyalty potential, eventually transforming him into one of the empire's greatest field commanders. Whether embellished or not, the story reflected something important about Mongol leadership. Competence mattered more than origin. Jebi became known for aggression, operational independence, and extraordinary speed. He excelled in campaigns requiring flexibility across difficult terrain. Unlike commanders tied to slow administrative structures, Jebi operated with minimal delay between decision and action. For the campaign against Kuchulug, speed would be everything. The Mongol force assigned to the invasion was relatively small by the standards of major imperial wars, roughly 20,000 to 22,000 cavalry. On paper, this appeared insignificant compared to the forces theoretically available to Qara Khitai Authority and its regional allies. Estimates in medieval sources vary wildly, but combined Khitan, tribal, and auxiliary numbers may have approached or exceeded 100,000 men across the wider theatre. Yet numbers alone concealed deeper realities. Large medieval armies often struggled with coordination, discipline, and supply. Many soldiers were levies with inconsistent training. Command structures fragmented under pressure. Communication during battle was slow and chaotic. Armies moved at the pace of their slowest elements. The Mongols operated differently. Their military organization divided forces into highly disciplined decimal units, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Officers were selected largely through merit and battlefield performance. Units trained continuously in coordinated maneuver warfare. Riders could disperse across vast areas and regroup rapidly with remarkable precision. Most importantly, every Mongol campaign emphasized reconnaissance. Before major engagements occurred, Mongol scouts already understood river crossings, grazing conditions, mountain routes, settlement loyalties, and enemy positions. Information moved through relay systems far faster than most opponents could imagine. As Jebi prepared to move westward, the psychological situation inside Kuchulug's realm deteriorated further. Many Muslim communities despised Kuchulug's rule. Local rulers feared both the Mongols and their own unstable overlord. Merchants worried about collapsing trade security. Tribal confederations watched carefully, waiting to see which side appeared stronger. Central Asia was becoming politically hollow, and hollow states can collapse with terrifying speed once pressure is applied. The advance itself began with calculated restraint. Rather than devastating every settlement in his path, Jebi deliberately presented the Mongols as liberators from Kuchulug's rule. Religious freedom was promised to Muslim populations. Cities willing to cooperate were spared. Local grievances were exploited methodically. This was not mercy in the modern sense. It was strategy. Every city that opened its gates preserved Mongol strength for future operations. Every local guide gained shortened the campaign. Every tribe that defected weakened Kuchulug without requiring battle. As the Mongols crossed into the region, panic spread unevenly. Some governors prepared defenses. Others fled. Rumors exaggerated Mongol numbers until small cavalry columns seemed like endless armies emerging from the horizon. Meanwhile, Kuchulug struggled to impose centralized control over territories already slipping from his grasp. His authority depended heavily on fear. But fear is unstable when a greater terror arrives. The geography of the coming campaign added another layer of danger. The lands stretching across Samarkand and eastern Central Asia combined open grasslands with mountain corridors, river valleys, deserts, and fortified oasis settlements. Armies unfamiliar with the terrain could easily become trapped or exhausted. But Gebi moved with extraordinary confidence. His cavalry advanced in dispersed formations, maintaining mobility while denying the enemy clear targets. Scouts ranged far ahead. Intelligence from local populations improved daily as resentment toward Kuchlug deepened. The campaign was becoming less a conventional invasion and more a controlled unraveling of an already weakened state. Still, Kuchlug was not facing mere rebellion. He was facing the most adaptive military machine the medieval world had yet seen. And soon, the political collapse spreading across Central Asia would turn into total military catastrophe. By the summer of 1218, the campaign had entered a far more dangerous phase. The initial Mongol advance into Qara Khitai territory had achieved something larger than territorial penetration. It had destabilized the psychological structure of the state itself. Cities that once obeyed Kuchlug now hesitated. Tribal chiefs delayed mobilization orders. Garrisons questioned whether reinforcements would ever arrive. The Mongols had not yet destroyed the empire militarily, but they were steadily dismantling its cohesion. For medieval states built upon personal loyalty and regional power balances, cohesion mattered as much as raw manpower. Armies could only function if commanders trusted one another, supply networks remained intact, and soldiers believed the political order behind them would survive. Inside Kuchlug's realm, that confidence was disappearing, and Gebi understood exactly how to exploit it. The Mongol commander avoided becoming fixed around large sieges or static positions. Instead, he maintained operational momentum across enormous distances, forcing local rulers into constant uncertainty. One day, Mongol cavalry appeared near a mountain pass. Days later, they emerged hundreds of kilometers away near another settlement entirely. To opponents accustomed to slower medieval campaigning, this movement seemed almost unnatural. The Mongol horse system made it possible. Each rider maintained several remounts, allowing units to preserve speed without exhausting their animals completely. Warriors traveled light, carried preserved food, and survived with minimal baggage compared to conventional armies. Entire formations could move with astonishing independence. But mobility alone did not explain Mongol success. Discipline did. European chroniclers later described steppe warfare as chaotic swarming cavalry. But Mongol operations were highly organized beneath the surface. Signal flags, drums, horns, and pre-arranged maneuver systems allowed units to coordinate, even during rapid movement. Officers understood objectives before battle began. Feigned retreats, encirclements, and dispersed attacks were rehearsed repeatedly during training. Many opposing armies mistook flexibility for disorder. By the time they recognized the structure behind Mongol tactics, it was usually too late. Kuchlug attempted to answer the growing crisis by assembling larger concentrations of force across the region. Khitan troops, tribal auxiliaries, local levies, and allied contingents were gathered wherever authority still functioned. Medieval sources later inflated the numbers dramatically, some claiming forces approaching 180,000 across the theatre. The exact figure remains uncertain. But what mattered was not the numerical accuracy. What mattered was the reality behind it. Kuchlug's coalition was enormous compared to Gebi's compact cavalry army. Yet size created its own weaknesses. Large medieval forces consumed massive quantities of food and fodder. Communication between commanders slowed dramatically over distance. Different ethnic groups obeyed different leaders. Trust between contingents remained fragile. Most dangerous of all, many soldiers entering the campaign already doubted the stability of the regime they were fighting for. Gebi deliberately intensified those doubts. As Mongol detachments swept through towns and caravan routes, proclamations spread ahead of them promising protection for communities willing to abandon Kuchlug. Muslim populations, previously alienated by religious persecution, increasingly viewed the Mongols not as foreign destroyers but as the lesser threat. This represented one of the most important strategic realities of the campaign. The Mongols rarely relied on battlefield violence alone. They weaponized politics, religion, fear, diplomacy, and reputation simultaneously. Entire enemy coalitions could begin disintegrating before major combat even occurred. And the environment of Central Asia amplified every weakness. The region's geography did not favor large centralized armies. Movement corridors narrowed between mountain ranges, Rivers complicated logistics. Grazing areas determined operational possibilities for cavalry. Summer heat punished exhausted formations, while sudden storms and cold nights added further strain. JB adapted to these conditions with remarkable precision. Rather than concentrating all 22,000 riders into a single visible mass, he distributed forces across multiple operational directions. Reconnaissance groups remained active constantly. Supply opportunities were taken locally whenever possible. Captured intelligence was integrated rapidly into planning. The Mongols turned geography into an ally rather than an obstacle. Meanwhile, Kuchlug's situation worsened by the week. Reports arriving from across his territory became increasingly contradictory. One governor claimed Mongol forces were retreating. Another warned that entire districts had defected. Scouts disappeared. Tributary tribes stopped responding. Merchants carried stories of Mongol detachments moving through supposedly secure regions. Fear began affecting decision-making at every level. This was one of the least visible but most devastating aspects of Mongol warfare. Panic distorts command judgment. Leaders under constant uncertainty begin reacting emotionally rather than strategically. They overcommit troops to secondary threats. They abandon strong positions too early. They mistrust subordinates. They delay critical movements while waiting for clear information that never arrives. The Mongols cultivated exactly this atmosphere. At the same time, Jebi avoided reckless engagement. Contrary to later mythologizing, Mongol commanders were not suicidal aggressors, obsessed with frontal assaults. They preferred favorable conditions, vulnerable opponents, and situations where confusion could be maximized. When facing larger forces, they relied on maneuver, fragmentation, and exhaustion. Their goal was not heroic battle. It was systematic destruction. As the campaign deepened, the central theater increasingly shifted toward the regions surrounding the Ili Valley and the approaches leading toward Kashgar and the eastern reaches of Central Asia. These areas formed critical movement corridors between mountain systems and major settlements. Whoever controlled them controlled mobility itself. Kuchlug attempted to consolidate resistance there, hoping terrain restrictions might finally slow Mongol operational superiority. Larger forces could potentially trap dispersed cavalry if coordination held long enough, but coordination was precisely what his coalition lacked. The Mongols exploited this weakness relentlessly. Small advance units struck supply caravans and isolated detachments. Scouts fed constant information back to JB. Local populations increasingly refused to support Kuchlug's movements. Some settlements opened gates immediately upon Mongol arrival, denying the defenders fallback positions. Under these conditions, numerical superiority became difficult to use effectively. Large armies require stable infrastructure. Without reliable supplies, communications, and local support, massive forces become slow-moving concentrations of anxiety and hunger. Soldiers grow exhausted before battle even begins. Animals weaken. Desertion rises quietly in the background. The Mongols understood this process intimately because they had spent generations surviving within harsh environments where mobility determined survival. Their enemies often did not. Eventually, the campaign moved toward direct confrontation. Accounts from the period remain fragmented and sometimes contradictory, but the overall pattern is clear. Kuchlug's forces attempted to resist through larger field concentrations, while Jeba maneuvered aggressively to isolate and break portions of the enemy before unified resistance could emerge. The battlefield environment favored speed over rigidity. Dust clouds reduced visibility. Communication across sprawling formations became unreliable. Terrain shifts disrupted cohesion between different contingents. Mounted archers moved in and out of engagement zones rapidly, forcing opponents into constant repositioning. For soldiers facing the Mongols for the first time, the psychological pressure could be overwhelming. Traditional armies often expected battle lines to stabilize into relatively predictable formations. The Mongols denied that stability completely. They attacked from multiple directions, withdrew suddenly, reappeared elsewhere, and maintained relentless missile pressure throughout movement. Exhaustion accumulated quickly. Heavy cavalry or infantry attempting pursuit frequently found themselves isolated. Units that advanced too far risked encirclement. Commanders struggled to determine whether Mongol withdrawals represented genuine retreat or deliberate traps. Often, they were traps. Jebi's greatest advantage may not have been numbers or even mobility alone. It was tempo. The Mongols consistently forced events to unfold faster than opponents could mentally process them. Decisions that normally unfolded over days suddenly required immediate reaction. By the time enemy commanders understood one development, another crisis had already emerged elsewhere. This operational tempo shattered coordination, and once cohesion began failing inside pre-modern armies, collapse could spread with terrifying speed. During the major engagements of the campaign, Mongol horse archers exploited this vulnerability mercilessly. Arrows rained continuously against exposed formations, while mobile detachments targeted command elements and weaker flanks. Feigned withdrawals lured aggressive pursuers away from support. Then came the counterstroke. Fresh Mongol units, often hidden behind terrain or positioned beyond visual range, would suddenly converge against overextended forces. Encirclement followed rapidly. Communication disappeared inside growing dust and confusion. For many Khitan and allied troops, the battlefield no longer resembled organized war. It became disorientation. Noise drowned orders. Visibility collapsed. Riders emerged suddenly through dust before vanishing again. Units separated from neighboring formations lost all sense of the wider battle. Rumors spread instantly. Commanders killed, flanks broken, reserves destroyed. Whether true or not barely mattered. Psychology was becoming decisive. Some contingents fought stubbornly, particularly hardened cavalry loyal to Kuchlug personally. But even effective resistance struggled against the Mongols' ability to sustain pressure while remaining operationally flexible. Whenever defenders attempted consolidation, Mongol mobility disrupted it. Whenever commanders attempted pursuit, the battlefield widened further. The larger coalition gradually lost the ability to function as a single force, and Jebi pressed harder. The Mongol commander recognized the exact moment when resistance shifted from organized opposition into cascading fragmentation. At that stage, pursuit became more important than direct engagement. Retreating forces had to be denied time to regroup. Mongol cavalry excelled at precisely this kind of warfare. Fast-moving detachments pursued fleeing units relentlessly across rivers, valleys, and open steppe. Exhausted soldiers abandoned equipment. Horses collapsed from overuse. Groups attempting withdrawal discovered Mongol riders already appearing ahead of them. The campaign transformed from battle into systematic annihilation. Across Central Asia, surviving witnesses carried stories of entire formations disappearing during retreat, of commanders unable to locate their own forces, of roads filled with abandoned animals and broken supply wagons. Kuchlug himself soon realized the strategic reality confronting him. The war was no longer merely being lost militarily. His authority was dissolving in real time. And once that realization spread among his remaining supporters, the final collapse became almost impossible to stop. By late 1218, the war in Central Asia had already moved beyond the point of strategic recovery. What remained was not a contest between two organized powers, but the gradual disintegration of one side under sustained operational pressure. Kuchlug's authority, once projected across the fragmented territories of the Qara Khitai Empire, had been reduced to scattered zones of control held together more by fear than coherence. The Mongols, meanwhile, had achieved something far more decisive than battlefield victories. They had broken the structure that allowed resistance to exist in the first place. Jebi's campaign did not rely on a single climactic engagement. Instead, it functioned as a continuous tightening of pressure across multiple fronts. Every defeated detachment, every abandoned settlement, every defection by a local commander reduced the system's ability to respond to the next crisis. Collapse in medieval empires rarely occurs in a single moment. It accumulates, and then suddenly becomes visible all at once. The turning point emerged when coordinated resistance could no longer be assembled at scale. Kuchlug attempted to regroup surviving forces into a final defensive posture, relying on what remained of his loyal cavalry and whatever regional levies could still be compelled into service. But by this stage, even loyalty had become unreliable. Some commanders delayed orders, others withdrew their units preemptively, unwilling to risk annihilation in a battle they no longer believed could be won. Supply routes failed to deliver consistent support. Communication between regions became fragmented, sometimes disappearing entirely for weeks at a time. The Mongols did not need to destroy every army in the field. They only needed to ensure that no army could remain intact long enough to matter. Genghis' forces continued operating with the same disciplined flexibility that had defined the campaign from its earliest stages. Small detachments screened larger movements. Rapid strikes targeted isolated formations. Reconnaissance units identified weak points in real time and transmitted intelligence back through established relay systems. The battlefield itself had expanded into an entire region. And within that region, no single Khitan concentration could remain stable. As the Mongols pressed deeper into the core territories of the collapsing Khanate, Kuchlug's political isolation became absolute. His earlier reliance on coercion had alienated many of the settled Muslim populations, who now saw Mongol advance as an opportunity for relief rather than invasion. This shift in perception proved decisive. Cities that might have resisted instead chose accommodation or neutrality. Local leaders, prioritizing survival, opened negotiations, or simply refused to mobilize forces. The administrative network that Kuchlug depended on ceased to function effectively outside a shrinking circle of loyalists. In practical terms, the state was already gone. Only its final movements remained. Kuchlug attempted escape as Mongol pressure converged toward his remaining strongholds. Accounts suggest he fled into the mountainous regions of what is now western China and eastern Central Asia, hoping terrain might offer what armies could not. But geography, which once slowed invasions, now worked against him in a different way. Mountain routes restrict movement. Valleys channel escape paths. Remote settlements become points of exposure rather than refuge. The same terrain that complicates large armies also limits the options of fugitives attempting to vanish. Mongol intelligence networks proved especially effective in such conditions. Local informants, shifting allegiances, and the promise of security under Mongol authority created a flow of information that steadily narrowed Kuchlug's possible routes. Genghis' forces did not need to search blindly. They followed patterns of movement shaped by geography and desperation. Eventually, Kuchlug was located and captured,